AskReddit by SGT Skillcraft. Richard Feynman said, "Never confuse education with intelligence. You can have a PhD and still be an idiot." What are some real-life examples of this? My ex-boyfriend's mother was a linguistics professor and knew over 10 languages. She was also one of the dumbest people I've ever met. Some examples: she believed that in case of emergency stewardesses catapult out of the plane. She was also convinced donating blood causes some blood disease and you can die because of it. But my favorite one was when she said her son's orthopedic problems are not a result of a serious injury he had. His knee hurts because he eats too much ketchup. Man, that ketchup is going straight to my knees. I need to sit for a minute. My professor, a brilliant neurosurgeon, once decided to directly smell a bottle of ammonia. He then told me, "Don't smell that." I did not plan to. Relevant XKCD. https://xkcd.com/242. Me masters in cybersecurity and can't help my 5th grader with his math homework. Don't worry. It doesn't get easier. My first call at my first job was in a medical laboratory. There was a doctor who had been in the job for years and she called saying her computer would not power on. I walked her through some troubleshooting and nothing worked. Is the computer plugged in? Okay. Is the monitor on? Okay. When did the problem start? Type of questions were asked and she answered them all. I go up to her office and indeed the computer is plugged into a power strip which is plugged into itself. Cleaning crew had deep cleaned her office and never plugged anything back in. DR plugged the power strip into itself thinking that as long as it was plugged in, that's all she needed. Part of me wonders if she got the cords mixed up, like she thought what she was plugging in was something other than the power strip. Depending on the length of the cords, I could see it getting lost in the tangle and just plugging it in. I had a boss who was an engineer who put a couple $100 in change in a bank's pneumatic drive-through tube where it got stuck and they had to use a jackhammer to get it out. He was upset that the bank was charging him for this because he didn't know this would happen. They had large signs saying not to put change in the tubes, including on the tubes themselves. He just filled the thing with random change, not in rolls or anything. Like he thought it was a fucking coinster? That's hilarious. Unless you were in line behind him. Deleted. My mother has a PhD and she fell for a similar type of scam, only hers was one of those social security agent scams. She ended up spending about $10k on Google Play gift cards. She still maintains she wasn't scammed too. In her mind, since she is a PhD, therefore intelligent, and wasn't elderly, she was 64 at the time. A scammer would not target her. I went to 3 ERs when I felt something was wrong with my arm. It felt like a bug bite day 1 and by day 4 a bungee cord from my elbow to my wrist. 3 doctors said it was a skin irritation or dermatitis. I kept telling them something was wrong. I have no medical degree. I work in property management. Day 5 I walked into another ER and said I don't care if I have to pay out of pocket or sit here all night but something is wrong with my arm. Finally, after many rude looks and comments I was given an ultrasound of my arm. Then rushed to MRI. Then told I was being admitted. Or 3 inches blood clot in my upper arm, 2 in my chest area, and 1 had passed my lung already. Diagnosed with factor 2 gene mutation 22 days later. Blood clotting disorder. Damn. Good for you being persistent. That is pretty wild that they missed that. I'm glad you did finally get a proper diagnosis. Did you call back to the other places to tell them what asses they were? I have a PhD, and I work with a bunch of PhDs. Basically, a lot of them think that because they succeeded in one area, they are an expert in every other area of life. And they always have strong opinions about everything. I think it's also called the PhD syndrome. I think my imposter syndrome cannibalized my PhD syndrome. Deleted. From what I've heard from people with PhDs is that you can get called up, but lawyers will always dismiss you immediately because they think you must have good critical thinking skills and are harder to persuade. My ex-wife with a PhD in neuroscience driving my car around with the handbrake on, calling me to ask about the noise and smell. LMAO, I have a bachelor's in neuroscience and did the same as a new driver. I was at a keg party at college and a gravity keg was set up. Someone complained that the beer was not flowing, so I checked that the keg was still almost full. Turns out someone closed the air intake on top. I opened the intake and poured myself a beer. Problem solved. A few minutes later someone else complains the beer is out. I told them the keg was full a few minutes ago and it was a tap problem that I fixed. They told me they just came from the keg. I go back to the keg and find the intake was closed again. Opened it and poured the young lady who said it was empty a beer. As she is leaving, my suitemate comes in and goes to the intake can, closes it. Now my suitemate is a straight A student who gets all A's mostly due to his photographic memory. Back to the keg. So I tell him that he needs to leave the intake open to let air in to displace the beer coming out of the lower tap. Either. I seriously fucking hope that was not a real response. My wife's stepfather was a chemist who currently has diabetes. One night he went to the ER because his blood sugar was dangerously high. He claimed he was eating well, he normally doesn't, so there's no reason why his blood sugar was high. In his car was a 2-liter bottle of ginger ale mixed in with grape juice. He said that the two cancelled their sugars out and we didn't know what we were talking about because he was a chemist and he knows how to combine things. Holy fuck. That is insane. I worked it for a hospital. I was speaking to a doctor who forgot his password. While he was spelling his name phonetically over the phone, he said, Z as in xylophone. Needless to say, my eyebrows raised. I work in software development for a major chain of hospitals. One of the executives, MD, asked me to make a substantial UI change to a product owned by McKesson. Them just change the colors, it's simple, my teenager could do it. Me, I can make the request of the vendor. Them, that's ridiculous, you just need to go in there and change it. Out of spite I made the request with the vendor, and they came back with a quote that was more than to liver transplants. The executive told my CTO I was being difficult, and couldn't perform simple tasks. He literally did not understand that vendor software was different than a Wix website. I worked with a girl that graduated from Brown. She would never shut up about it, always Brown this and Brown that. I went to a state school and it was apparent that she looked down on anyone that didn't attend an Ivy League school. So one day she was doing that and I couldn't stop myself. I said something like, "Oh, you went to Brown and yet, here we are, together in the same place, doing the same job." I had someone on my shift who wouldn't shut up about being older and college educated. She was 3 ranks below me. She had no grasp on the concept of experience. My college roommate, smartest person I've ever met, spent nearly an hour trying to shove a desk back into the corner of our room at an angle. She wouldn't listen to me because in her words she got this. After she finally gave up, I walked over, pulled the desk out completely and straightened it with the wall, and pushed it back in. One movement, no struggle. Many a time we had where I'd realize she might be the smart one but I've got more common sense. That's spatial reasoning stuff and just one indicator of how there are many different types of intelligence. While I wouldn't struggle with that because my spatial reasoning is pretty decent if the problem is visually in front of me, I would totally struggle with that problem if I was asked to do it in my head. Since I'm an affant, I cannot mentally visualize. Edit. I was schooled that there are not different types of intelligence. What I was describing are skills and abilities often conflated, but not representing, with intelligence. Peter Duesberg, molecular biologist who works as a researcher at UC Berkeley and has an otherwise stellar career and well known for his work, became an AIDS denialist, claiming there's no link between HIV and AIDS. led countless people down the rabbit hole, including many who were HIV positive. These individuals ended up infecting others and refusing antiretroviral therapies. This included an AIDS denialist activist named Christine Marchior who infected her infant through breastfeeding, thinking, hey, it's not a big deal, it's just HIV, it doesn't cause AIDS. Kary Mullis, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing PCR, also questioned the link between HIV and AIDS. I chatted with him on a plane once and he was indeed pretty dumb. Edit. Dumb in many ways, but clearly unique and smart in others. I'm not here to bash Kary Mullis because PCR is cool as hell and he seemed cool in some ways too. I worked for a statistician who had a PhD in statistics and was dumb as a post. Otto. I worked with this really smart guy who happened to have a PhD, and as he said it, all that means is I did the work for a PhD. I worked with a climate scientist who could analyze climate data like nobody's business, but if you wanted him to do literally anything else you had to hold his hand the entire time. Zero common sense. 2. The senior staff at that office idolized him because of the PhD after his name, but one time he was in a car accident in a work vehicle, also his fault, and I asked for a copy of the police report for insurance purposes, and he said he didn't get one because I thought you handled that. Why would I, who was not present at the time of the accident, have the police report that was written at the time of the accident? The other guy that you ran into has one. Not quite PhD. But I was at a party, in the UK, full of med students and stereotypically everyone was off their face drunk. Well, some guy fell over and broke his collarbone and immediately got rushed by a dozen of them all fussing and asking him the same questions over and going through the checklist. Half an hour later and he's still on the couch in pain and I go in to ask if anybody knows why the ambulance is taking so long. Nobody had an answer because nobody had called one. A party full of medical students hadn't called an ambulance or made any transport arrangements for a guy in severe pain with a broken clavicle. Idiots. That's actually super common in emergencies when there's a group of any kind. One of the first things you learn in a lifeguard certification course is to identify a single person to instruct to call 911. Never just yell out someone call 911 or assume that it's been done because everyone in the group is assuming someone else did it already. It's not necessarily that everyone forgot about it, just that everyone assumed it was the logical first step that someone else would have taken already. I used to work at a university, and tons of academics are incredibly educated in their chosen field, but have the common sense of your average dachshund. My favorite was probably an entire group of geology professors and PhD candidates who got stuck for a good few minutes in an entryway because they didn't think to check if the door required a pull rather than a push. Bearing in mind that they'd just entered with that same door not an hour before. I had a professor for higher mathematics who had real difficulties figuring out how to extract a cup of coffee from the vending machine. Bless him. I had a student job doing it for the classroom equipment at my college. My job wouldn't have existed if having a PhD meant you could figure out technology. I have a PhD and I am an idiot in most respects. All it takes to get a PhD is to be really good at or persistent in doing research in one narrow area of study. Edit. So several commenters pointed out that I simplified things too much. A PhD also requires hard work, luck, and some basic competence in a topic. But that doesn't preclude one from being completely clueless in other aspects of life. The best quote I've heard about this is they don't give PhDs to the smartest people, they give them to the most stubborn. I work with medical doctors all the time for work. Doctors are some of the dumbest smart people I have ever met. Deleted. As someone who works security in a hospital, I can say a good 90% of the doctors are smart but lack any type of common sense, and sometimes I wonder how they function on a day-to-day basis. Edit. I also forgot to mention I'm almost 2 years in a relationship with a pediatric cardiologist, and it's as shocking at home as it is with the ones I work with, LMAO, but I can't say it's boring. If pop culture has taught us anything, it is that they spend most of their non-doctoring time discussing their sex lives. I have been told that idiots are running the world, but if that's true, I would have thought I would be a little higher up. Apparently you suck at being an idiot. MBAs are probably the most overhyped group of people on the planet. I'm like 99% certain that nepotism was getting too obvious, so they had to invent an incredibly expensive degree that friends of rich people could get so that they could also get great jobs and become rich. Most MBAs I know are actually so dumb it hurts. My wife has 2 masters and a PhD, is internationally recognized in her field, and is an absent-minded doofus. My role in her life is to ensure that her car works, that she takes her meds, and that she eats things other than yogurt and eggs. She can be brilliant one minute, then walk into the side of a moving bus the next. I love her dearly, but she's a numpty. Worked at a tech company, was made team lead. One of our team members was a PhD in astrophysics. He would ping me constantly for how to do things that we had well documented. How to install certain programs, how to gain access to servers or code repositories. Literally, we would sit in Zoom calls together and I would just read the instructions out loud and watch him do them. I was utterly confused as to how he could breathe by himself. A longtime good friend, absolutely brilliant. Can literally beat you at chess blindfolded. Engineering in college and one of the smartest people I've ever met. But he's a big picture guy. Sees how things develop and great long-term vision. Incredibly successful. But little things? Guy couldn't pack a suitcase, wouldn't know how to book a flight. Was making boxed mac and cheese and couldn't figure out why it was so watery. Yeah, he didn't drain the water after the pasta was cooked. Mother-in-law has a PhD in something related to botany. She thought India was a continental island like Australia. To this day I still have no idea how that happened. When this came up, she was in her mid-60s. Dr. Ben Carson, one of the most skilled neurosurgeons alive, thinking that the Egyptian pyramids were used to store grain. This guy operated on the brain of a fetus while it was still in the womb. He was the first in human history to ever do that. I wonder if he got killed and replaced by a clone sometimes. A doctor telling me my 6-month-old couldn't have strep because she was infant and taking her to the ER because she was getting worse and no urgent cares were open and finding out she had strep. We called an ambulance because we suspected that my wheelchair-bound brother-in-law had a bad bladder infection that was making him delirious. The EMTs didn't believe us because he seemed rational when he correctly answered questions like, "What's today's date and who is the president?" We insisted that he needed to go to the hospital. They said, "Okay, let's load him on the gurney." My bill recoiled and said, "You can't put me on there. It's covered in spiders." Those French idiots who put non-medical grade silicone pads into people and caused death and cancer in 2010. Wait, what? What happened? I tried looking up non-medical grade silicone pads France 2010 and Google keeps giving me articles about menstrual pads. I know many people in the science field that conduct double-blind randomized controlled experiments in the lab and then go home and check their horoscopes. I'd like to jump out of the window right now, but I can't get up because my stomach hurts from laughing too hard. If you work it, you feel this. Every lawyer, doctor, celebrity and CEO I've ever worked with is computer illiterate. They can email, they can Twitter, and that's it. They confuse the mouse, they openly call themselves Luddites, they kick the power plug out and claim the box broke. Mega millionaires, too. Smart in other regards, but computers are kryptonite. In fairness, team interactions are very heavily biased to helping the people who can't help themselves. As an aside, look at how much nepotism factors into getting into an Ivy League school before being automatically impressed that someone has a degree from one. I told a girl who went to Columbia that David Duchovny must be smart because he did undergrad and grad school at Ivy League schools. She shook her head no. Nepotism can get you into college there, and from there are kingmaker professors who can write you a good letter to get you to the next level. My uncle is smart as fuck. Multiple master's degrees in education and science, constantly wins awards for his teaching and high averages from his students. Tell me why this idiot needed me to remind him how to make ramen several times over? Not a PhD, but I know someone who has a master's in finance and thinks everyone should just own a house. I was like, how are they gonna pay for it? He was like, they should work hard. I couldn't stop laughing. If you're homeless, just buy a house. To get a doctorate, you need to know absolutely nothing about a wide range of subjects. I thought it was knowing more and more about less and less until you knew absolutely everything about nothing. I knew a nuclear engineer that worked at Bruce Nuclear, one of the largest nuclear power plants on Earth. He made a 7-figure salary for his expertise in nuclear physics. He was able to explain to me, in detail, how Chernobyl happened and how it was impossible with Canadian can-do reactor designs. And then a few hours later he showed me his magnetic copper bracelet he got at the pharmacy. Said it captures the negative ions in his blood and helps with his arthritis. Placebo is a hell of a drug. Boris Johnson, former PM of the UK, is a good example of what happens when a first-class education encounters a vacuum. Absolutely colossal moron who was insanely out of his depth and is only not going to be remembered as the worst PM the UK ever had due to his successor, Liz Truss, who only lasted a little over a month by deciding what the UK really needed when everyone was in financial difficulty following Brexit, and a terribly managed response to COVID was tax breaks for the rich, leaving the UK just hours from bankruptcy. And yet, somehow, Boris still seems the bigger idiot. Education is filled with people with master's degrees I wouldn't want teaching my kid. My old psychiatrist was morally against prescribing certain effective medications and instead recommended I continue to consume almost twice the daily limit of caffeine instead. Had decades of experience and my therapist thinks quite highly of him, but I do not share her enthusiasm. Let me guess, meds? Dr. Oz. He really went to Harvard. He really is a university professor. He really did pioneer several cardiac surgery techniques. Also, he promoted hydroxychloroquine to fight COVID after reading about it on the internet. I don't mention the obvious scams that he flogs on his TV show because I don't think he really believes in them. I think it's an act he puts on just to scam gullible people. Well, that's the thing. Not sure how much of Oz is really Dr. Idiot when it comes to non-scope of expertise and how much his scammers gonna scam y'all. Oz is a grifter, plain and simple. My grandfather has a doctorate in biochemistry from Caltech, spent his professional career in academia doing research and teaching around the world. In this area, and some others, he is incredibly smart. In many other respects he has the common sense of a toddler, and sometimes it seems amazing that he ever made it to his 80s. Many us politicians are lawyers from prestigious schools but are also idiots. They're not idiots. They're liars and grifters. They're not stupid, they're evil. There's a difference, and failing to realize that will only underestimate them. I know a geologist who's a flat earther. A goddamn geologist of all people. Also, anti-vax healthcare workers. WTF.